What's up, guys? This is Ryan Fee for upswingpoker.com, and what I want to talk about in this video is how to play versus a 3-bet. Once you've raised first in and you've isolated a raise and you face a 3-bet, what do? And we're going to break it up between in position and out of position. So, all right, to kick things off, go check out our screen here. So, you know what? We're missing this. We've got almost everything we need here. We got a notepad file to keep a couple things, and we are going to get a handy dandy calculator to crunch some numbers with. All right, so first example, we're going to raise first in the hijack. Let's say that we have any of these hands that are red or pink, and we're going to face a 3-bet. This is, by the way, what I'm using here is the preflop hand range viewer out of the Upswing Poker lab. So let's say we face a 3-bet, and we're just going to take our range. It's hard to say what range you might be up against, but we'll say that we face, somebody's playing the exact lab strategy, and they 3-bet a range of these hands. So let's say they're pretty thug. They like to get in there, 3-betting all the hands. Okay, so this is a 3-bet range we're up against, and so now we're gonna go back to our hijack raise first in, and we're gonna do some bet sizing stuff. So we're gonna say that we open a 2.5. They 3-bet to. We'll start by saying 8. Okay, so and we're gonna say that everyone folds gets back to us, and we're gonna think about how do we we won't focus on 4-bet, but we'll just focus on calls. So what hands do we call this bet with? So in this situation, blinds are folded. It's going to be 5.5 chips to win a total pot of 17.5. So divide 5.5, which is our call, by the total pot, which is 17. So we need 32%. Okay. So now simply what we do is we just figure out, well, what hands will have 32% equity. We can call this bet. So, okay, this is our opponent's range. So let's pick some hands that are going to be sort of along the edge. First hand we'll pick will be, let's say King-9 suited. Actually, we'll start at King-Queen suited. This is a hand that's a slam dunk call. So King-Queen suited versus this range, 38%. That said, I would expect King-Queen suited to overrealize. If you look at sort of what this range is, it's a lot of, especially when you have King-Queen, you're sort of making it less likely Ace-King, Kings, Queens. Part of their range, really likely they have any number of these suited aces. Also, I mean, the other thing to consider is, let's say they don't have some of the weaker suited aces, the range is different. Sort of all of a sudden King Queen has a little bit less equity. So, whoops, whoopsie daisy. Okay, so let's say they have all these hands. We've got 37.82% equity. Okay, and then we'll sort of go down the list here. Okay, so like a little bit less with King Jack, well, King 10 a little bit. About the same with King 10. It's pretty close. Remember, this is and this is going to be highly subjective. Your opponent could certainly 3-bet hands like King Queen offsuit, King, King Queen, King Jack, Queen Jack suited themselves, 10-9 suited, things like that. So this, this is really just sort of a guess. Even though this is a raw equity calc, which is this is actually how much raw equity you have. But you're sort of guessing your opponent's range, so you can never know for sure. So, okay. So we need about 32% equity to call. And what we're looking at here is, King-9 suited has some raw equity. The thing is, though, simply based on the fact that you're calling a 3-bet, you're playing this pot out of position, there's going to be some equity lost with many hands, and it's going to be lost towards sort of the weaker end of the spectrum. So, like I said, King-Queen suited, I would expect to. So King-Queen suited had 38% equity, which is about 38% equity. I would expect that to probably clear 40%, I think pretty comfortably. King-Queen suited is such a powerful hand. Whereas like a hand like King-9 suited, sort of the pairs, straight draws, straights, things you'll be making are going to be a little bit less powerful, and you have like a little bit worse removal. So I would say that and mostly just coming down to the straight and sort of pair potential of the Queen versus the 9. I would tend to say that King-9 is probably, because of the gap, would under-realize, or would not do as good of a job of if they're holding up or over-realizing. So I think at very best, King-9 suited will realize its equity. Will realize 100% of its equity. So in this spot, King-9 suited would be a call if it realized 100% of its equity. King 8 suited, though, without making the straight, I think is probably going to be a bit worse, and sort of, again, the pair value. So I would say I would probably tend to draw the line at King 9 or King 10 here. I don't think, I don't think King 8 is going to make a, I think King 8 ends up doing kind of poorly. Because it's this lack of being able to make a straight. We'll do the same thing with, let's say, Queen 9 suited. Queen 9 suited. What did King 9 suited have? Queen 9 suited doing so good. It must be because of the Ace King factor. I suppose that's something to consider. That you can't really ignore that. But given this is like a very specific range, but versus the range that we're talking about, because sort of it has Ace King, it doesn't have Ace Queen. Like if we were then to go in, like what if we added Ace Queen to this? So if Ace Queen was in there. So it loses a full percentage of equity, which is again a very, very big deal. Whereas King 9, and all of a sudden King 9's been doing better. So again, it's like it can become very subjective based on like precisely what sort of your opponent's range is. But like you can't ignore that if they don't have Ace Queen, the value of Queen 9 suited increases dramatically, and that's something to think about. What about Jack 9 suited? Jack 9 suited has about the same amount of equity. What about 10 9 suited? Okay, 10 9 suited, even more equity actually, which is interesting, especially because a hand like 10 9 suited, a suited connector will tend to overrealize its equity. So like I would say everywhere, like you're always going to call those suited broadways for the most part. So then you're going to kind of look at the suited 9s which are connected, and sort of do you have the pot odds to call them? In this situation, you probably do. Especially given that they're hands which are likely to hold up and realize their equity. For instance, if we took a hand like Ace 10 offsuit, Ace 10 offsuit has much more equity here than Ace 10 offsuit has much more equity here than sort of the other hands that we just went over. But I would expect Ace 10 offsuit to realize its equity. It would be much more difficult to realize this amount of equity with Ace 10 offsuit. Like if sort of that was the case, you could probably even throw Ace 5 offsuit in here. Oh no, Ace 5 gets hammered. What about Ace 9? Ace 9 is still doing really well. And the reason being is simply, again, specifically for this range, is that it's sort of doing, it has so many suited aces, it's really crushing. Whereas if we dumped some of these and then we put in, sort of some of these, all of a sudden Ace 10 offsuit takes a huge equity hit. So again, specifically what range you're up against is going to make a big difference. The other thing is, again, given either range, Ace 10 offsuit is going to tend to under-realize. The reason being is that it's kind of going to be hard to win a pot out of position with Ace High, sort of like very often. And when you're up against Ace King, like you're kind of going to be getting owned by like both of you flopping top pair. Flopping a 10 is great, but can get dicey. I mean, there's just like when you think about the practical ways of what happens with this hand, even though you can realize equity and it could be a call depending upon the range, it's definitely like a lot closer. Like we would definitely, we don't even open Ace 9, but we would definitely not open and then call Ace 9. Sort of, again, if hands are weaker, they're offsuit, they're unconnected, they're going to realize less equity. As they're suited connected, they're going to realize more equity. If we go back then to sort of the original range, and again, this is like a specific calculation. Like you could do a more general calculation and then have a bit more of a balanced range. You don't have to be so subjective to just pick the hands that are in our range. Anyway, so let's say though, let's just play around. Well, actually, let's throw before we do that, we're going to throw in pocket pairs. Deuces doing quite well. What about five? But are going to under-realize. Fives doing like pretty well as well. I think fives, given this bet size, you're definitely going to call. Fours are going to be like a bit of a maybe. And then threes, twos and threes are going to be close, but probably a fold. And again, because they're going to under-realize by a decent amount. It's just very difficult. I mean, other than flopping a set, you're always just going to have under pairs with those hands. So they just, in this situation, they end up realizing equity kind of quite poorly. And that's it. Given the bet size, it's going to be pretty close with these hands. If it was any bigger, like I would say probably not. Speaking of any bigger, let's go to 9x. Let's say that they face a 3-bet to 9x. So now in this instance, it's going to be, so that's 7, 8, 6.5. So 6.5 to win a total pot of 19.5. So here we need 33%. And remember, because we're analyzing the hands at the margin, that actually makes a pretty big difference. Like, calling this bet size, actually like a full percent more, in terms of like realized equity is going to be different. It's going to be much different from calling. If it's like, so let's say for the 8x, let's say we call all the 9s, we call all of our suited 9s. We play like, we could also do the suited aces, but Sure, why not? I think like ace-8 suited, given the smaller bet size. Yeah, I think ace-8 suited versus that range is probably fine to call. Say like ace-5 suited could call or 4-bet. Ace-5, ace-4 suited could call or 4-bet. So, in other words, what hands would I play here? So I'm going to say we're going to play... We're going to play something like... And these hands could be 4-bet or calls. Depending. And 10-8 would be sort of on the fence, but probably versus 8x, we're going to lean toward a call. It's okay. Let's look at 10-8 suited. So 10-8 suited, 35% equity, but again, it's a suited connector. It's going to tend to at least realize its equity, or sometimes over-realize it. It sort of depends. But you know, the raw number, the suited connectors tend to realize around the raw number. So the 10-8 suited is probably a call, and then 9-7 can kind of go either way, probably each bet size. So yeah, so we'll play a range, you know, sort of similar to this. So actually, we'll throw in king queen off, which is going to kind of be the weakest hand of everything. So king queen off, king queen off is going to be dicey, but again, it's sort of like it's good. King queen suffers from the fact that your opponent has all these suited aces, but you actually realize equity pretty well because the suited aces are going to miss. You know, when an ace peels where the suited ace has a ton of equity, king queen is going to get out of the way. You know, pretty comfortably. Probably not going to be losing very many big pots. You know, there's definitely there's problems post flop with having a stacked suited ace 3-bet range. Whereas, you know, on like several other boards, when your opponent has all these suited aces or ace high hands, and you could be having, like, again, looking at the rest of this range, pocket pairs or making top pair, something like that. King queen will function as a pretty good bluff, and it'll make top pair. So, like, if the board's ace high, you're out of the way. If it's king or queen high, you're really happy. And if it's jack through like whatever high, you know, if we're looking at, did we delete the whole range? Oops. But if we're looking at the you know, sort of the rest of this range, there are value bets, you know, potential value bets that can be had, especially because oftentimes in those post-flop situations, a single pair, you know, could qualify as a value bet versus, you know, a range of a really stacked ace high. So yeah, king queen offsuit, I think for all those reasons, will do a pretty good job of realizing its equity. You know, as will, again, like a lot of these suited connectors and suited Broadway, stuff like that. So you're going to be playing versus the 8x. I mean, really versus both. You know, sort of both of them is going to come down to a range like similar to this. Because the other thing you could always do is you could be up against, you know, a range like this. We'll give them one more suited connectors. You know, virtually no bluffs, and then king queen offsuit is, first of all, is less raw equity, and then again, because of how strong this range is going to have less realized equity because it's not going to be taking away the pot from those suited ace hands. So, you know, sort of for that reason, and you'll probably see this, I'm going to guess, you know, sort of across the board. And like, again, I think the raw equity for 10-8 suited is very similar, but because of what hands are in this range, I think that the realized equity, you know, will be weaker essentially because, you know, we're having like ace queen. I think maybe we added 10s and then like less of these suited aces, like suited connectors, which are just stronger hands, and we'll again just like realize, you know, that this is it's honestly the most tricky concept in poker because listen, if you could just do this, if you could just say, oh, okay, well, you know, I need what were our odds? Like 33% equity, right? Say this was the range. Like, oh, 10-8 suited has 33% equity, call. What about 9-7 suited? 9-7 has 33% or greater percent equity, call. What about 5-4 suited? It has exactly 33% equity. In fact, it has 33 1/3. We got to call. So, you know, sort of going down the list, but because there's, you know, there's advantages or disadvantages to different hands and how much equity they'll actually realize, and you know, sort of especially based on pot to stack ratio and position, it's not always that simple. So what you're doing is, I mean, really just calculations like this, where you're looking at, oh, okay, what are my pot odds based on different bet sizes and different hand, and what is my raw equity? What are my pot odds based on different bet sizes? What is my raw equity based on different hand ranges? And then what is my realized equity? If you guys are already in the lab, actually, let me grab something real quick. If you're already in the lab, funny enough, in the tournament section of the lab, which I'm afraid that some cash game players did not go through, you may have missed I believe it was the Big Blind Introduction module. And what the Big Blind Introduction module talks about is equity realization. In fact, it gives rules to it because, you know, in tournaments there's an ante, so you're playing a lot of hands out of the Big Blind. We felt it was really important that you did get to know, you know, sort of how the Big Blind works. So I'm going to grab this real quick and talk about sort of the what are the rules. Okay, so here are a few rules. Here are the sort of Upswing Poker, few rules to figure out how much equity a hand could realize. So as they're stronger, they're going to tend, as you move towards aces, ace, king, queen suited, they're going to tend to realize more equity. As they're weaker, they move towards 5-4 suited, 3-4 offsuit, whatever, going to tend to realize less equity, raw equity. So just like as they're stronger, they're going to realize more, even over-realize. Like aces realizes more than 100% equity in the hand. That's how good aces is. And then, the hand like 7-2 offsuit, for instance, is almost certainly never going to realize its raw equity. And then sort of same thing. It's like what we're doing here for this equity realization, this like sort of raw equity calc. What we just did is we put it up against a stronger range, and we saw that it had less raw equity and was also going to have less realized equity. As you're up against these stronger hands that sort of can compete. If you're up against a whole range of just like suited aces, it becomes very difficult for their range to play efficiently because they have sort of all of these with one sort of hand. So it's like if the board isn't ace high or has a flush draw, or if it doesn't flush draw, they're in a tough spot. In general, position is going to add some amount of equity realization. Again, this situation we're talking about, the in-position player is going to realize more equity, whereas we're out of position, it's going to be a little bit tougher for us. Suited hands, suited and connectivity both play a role. So if a hand is suited, it's obviously going to realize not just the additional. So for instance, if we took, so let's say king queen suited. King, queen, suited, 37. We're going to call it a 37. Call it 37.5. Why not? We're going to call this 33.8. So, or 37.38 minus 33.8. So it's a 3.5. It's 3.5% equity difference. But honestly, king, queen, suited is going to realize, probably over-realize that equity, and king, queen offsuit might realize or even under-realize that equity. So it's going to be an even bigger disparity. Because when you make a flush or a flush draw or whatever, you can sort of get your opponent to fold the best hand, or you win a big pot with your flush, whatever. It ends up like the way that equity realizes post flop ends up being more valuable than just sort of specifically the raw equity. Because again, a lot of the worst boards, your hand just gets out of the way, and like that's where you lose. You'd be losing a lot of chips, but you end up playing small pots, and then you get to play big pots when when you have your hand is much stronger. Or make some sense as a bluff, or whatever it is. And then sort of same thing. Connectivity, like so it's, again, like if we did just a really silly calculation, like 5-4 offsuit. So 5-4 offsuit has 30% equity. What about king 2 offsuit or king? We'll do king 5 offsuit. King 5 offsuit has 30%, but I'd expect 5-4 offsuit to realize. Well, it's going to under-realize, but probably not by a ton. Like maybe 25% equity at worst, maybe around there, maybe a little less. But like king 5 offsuit is going to get hammered and realize like no equity in this, probably 20% if it's lucky. Just because you just don't ever make anything, you just always like lose the pot or you're in a tough bluff spot. So, any hoozles, that so that's I guess like the only the sort of the real thing to consider. So we look at our sort of equity calculation, we look at our pot odds, and then we sort of make these distinctions based on the strength of the hand. And there's going to be. I guess the other thing we didn't really include in there is skill edge, depending upon how good you are. If you're not comfortable calling as many 3-bets, it might not be as profitable for you to do so. That said, you might want to do it anyway, just to challenge yourself, to put yourself in a tough situation, to grow. So let's say that you would normally play King Jack suited. I think you should play King 9. You think you should play King Jack. Let's be in the middle and play King 10 suited. And again, sort of challenge and push yourself, because in general you shouldn't really be folding much to the 3-bet. The high stakes players, me and Doug, we don't really fold that much to 3-bet unless with sort of conventional sizings. Most of the time, the sizing has to get pretty big for us to start considering making folds. So that's, I guess, sort of the in position. The out of position. So we'll rip the range right out of the lab. So let's just say we face the small blind 3-bet range, which is like actually going to be quite similar. But the range isn't going to make the most huge difference. I'll give them all the suited aces. Why not? We'll give them ace queen suited too. So the range isn't going to make the most huge difference. It's mostly going to come down to, again, like the pot. So like in this situation, I don't think it's unreasonable for you to face a 3-bet to even 10x. It could be 10. We advocate going a little bit bigger in position. I think in position we want to go verse 2 we go 7, verse 2.5 we go 8, and verse 3 we go 9 in position. And essentially what that does is it allows us to 3-bet a lot of hands because it forces them to call or 4-bet us with a number of their hands, and if they don't, they're just going to be folding too much pre-flop. We're just going to be stealing the equity and blowing everybody else in the hand out of the hand. Whereas out of position, now all of a sudden the roles are reversed. You know, we're in position, so it's, you know, we're sort of, so here we have, I think this is the range. So we have a little bit worse raw equity, but we have position, so we're going to be able to realize more equity, you know, getting to see, have a little bit more information about our opponent's hand. That said, you know, you're likely to be up against a bigger bet size, so in this instance it would be, so 3-bet from the small blind. So the total pot is 21, we're going to have to call 7.5 to win the total pot of 21.5, so we're going to need about 35% equity, and again, you know, these, we're sort of, when you, the one thing I want you to take away from the raw versus realized equity is that you got to be really skeptical of the raw, because it's not, like, all of these hands are going to be much closer together than they seem. All of the hands that, you know, like if you're going to play 10-8, like 10-8 suited and king-queen offsuit are going to have really similar value because you're going to be folding king-jack, and, you know, you're like almost certainly going to be calling 10-9, so it's like, you know, it's like all the bottom hands are going to be pretty close, and that's, I mean, that's exactly what they should be. I mean, they you know, like it shouldn't go from you having calling a hand with 40% equity and then to like folding a hand with 35, or that your next hand would have 30. That just doesn't make any sense. There's more linearity to the strength of a lot of the medium strength hands, especially again in cash games, deeper stack sizes where skill plays a role. So, which also, by the way, is the beautiful thing about the game. So in this situation, this is why sort of we advocate for a bigger sizing, and you're likely to face a lot of bigger sizes, and if you're not, I mean, you're getting, again, you know, if they're if they're betting smaller, if they're making it 8, 9, or 8 to 7, I mean 7 to 8, to even like 8.5, like you're gonna want to play pretty greedy, right? Like let's say that you face the, what was the 8? It was like 32% equity. So 32% equity. I mean, man, like even 8-6 suited becomes like kind of appealing because it's a suited connector. Its raw equity is not going to be great, but it's going to hold it up pretty well. So it should be pretty close. You know, so it's going to be somewhere around 9, like 9-7 is going to be like pretty like call. Whereas, you know, a hand like 8-6 might not be. That said, all of our ranges pre-flop are meant to have bluffs. Like you might be up against, you know, this range, and there's no bluffs, and in which case you're going to get hammered on raw and then hammered on realized. So something to consider as well. You know, I guess sort of. So we're doing all this. What we're playing around with now is like sort of I guess a theoretical approach to how to play versus pre-flop 3-bet, right? It's like our hand, our equity, our pot odds. What happens? In actuality, the most important thing really is, well, the most important thing is a combination of bet size and hand range. And what that means is like, are you against a loose player or a tight player? Against a loose player, and how good that is that player. You know, against a bad tight player, you might want to play looser than you are against a good loose player, or maybe comparable. In general, though, as you're up against tighter ranges, you're going to be making more folds. As you're up against looser ranges, you'll be playing more hands as a call, and even a 4-bet, both value bet and bluff. So it's, you know, it's sort of this like it's complicated. You know, there's a lot of things to we're going on the list here. So the first one is bet size. Second one is equity versus range, and it's going to be, we're going to say realized equity versus range, which we've been sort of, you know, going back and forth and talking about this whole video, and it's complicated, it's hard, and, you know, it's essentially poker. It's, you know, it's like I said, if it was just this number we calced over here, the game would be solved and no one would play. It'd be no fun. It'd be like tic-tac-toe. So yeah, realized equity versus range. In position versus out of position. As you're in position, you know, you're going to realize more equity. And again, you could play the same if somebody raises to a bigger bet size out of position than they would in position. You might actually play the same range because you're getting, you know, essentially you're getting worse pot odds, but you're realizing more equity, or, you know, you're getting better pot odds, but then realizing less equity because of the positional advantage, disadvantage. So you might end up playing the same range, but you might not. Like, you know, again, this is sort of an exercise to teach you to think. Like, if somebody's 3-betting you to, if you're making it 2.5, and then somebody 3-bets you to 8 in position, and with the same hand range as they would 3-bet you to 8 big blinds out of position, you should definitely be playing more hands in position versus 3-bet than you should out of position. Bet size, realized equity versus hand range. how tight, and this goes into number 2, but or what hand range are you up against? Skill advantage, disadvantage. And the skill advantage, disadvantage, again, is like sort of the last thing to consider. If you're in the lab or you follow our pre-flop charts, generally, like part of your skill advantage is playing correctly, is like defending correctly pre-flop and then following the rules post-flop. And by playing arbitrarily tighter, you're almost, like by playing tighter because you're less confident, you're almost like that's where the edge is. Whereas like if you just played normal, got in there, played correctly pre-flop, and then bluffed and sort of hero called, did what you had to do post-flop, you'd be tougher to play against. You'd be a better player. You'd be able to realize more equity and sort of win more chips. So again, that's why I was saying I would challenge you. Like if you are coming from a more conservative background, push yourself. But yeah, I mean, you sort of factor all these things together, and then you decide what you want to do. The other thing that I would say is that you're more incentivized because of the advantage. I guess the last thing we'll talk about is 4-betting. So because of the advantage of position, it incentivizes you to 4-bet more hands. The reason is that if let's say a hand like tens, jacks, maybe ace queen, maybe even a suited ace, right? So like essentially some thinner value bets or maybe a couple other bluffs. You're incentivized to 4-bet those hands if they can be 4-bet profitably because the called pots again let your opponent realize equity, and you can have this sort of like really big or much bigger pot to stack ratio. Whereas in position, you're actually incentivized to call more hands because now all of a sudden you have the positional advantage, and your opponent will have to then make decisions sort of post flop. So which again is ultimately going to be more difficult, which is why those hands, the in position player realizes more equity. So by simply 4-betting and oftentimes ending a hand right there, getting all in pre-flop, or even playing in a 4-bet pot, sort of diminish the edge of position, whereas calling increases the edge of position. That said, when you're in position. That said, again, the most important thing is going to be hand range. If somebody's playing really tight 3-betting in position, you should not be 4-betting them very much. But if somebody's 3-betting a lot of hands, a lot of weak hands out of position, 4-betting them really with a really loose aggressive strategy is going to be very, very profitable. It's going to be better than having a lot of calls. Basically, you're going to do both. So versus the tight player, again, it's that sort of that and bet hand, sort of how tight they are and their bet size are going to be the most important things. That's what you're going to react to first, and then sort of the position and the position and sort of specifically what you expect your hand's equity to be, which would sort of be a little bit secondary or almost a product of the first two. So anyway, I hope this video helped. I hope it cleared up some what's going on pre-flop versus 3-betting. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments, and I will hopefully get to those as soon as possible. Oh, by the way, you could also find me on social media. I'm basically Ryan P. Poker everywhere. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thank you very much for watching that video. We really hope you enjoyed it. Doug and I are going to be running a contest this month to win an hour of coaching with each of us. There are going to be 2 winners drawn at the end of the month. Click the link here to be entered to win.